Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on social media. On today's episode, we are joined by Celia Sims, founder of the Abecedarian Group, who spent decades working on education policy on Capitol Hill. Sims is also a CASA volunteer in her spare time, and she wrote an op-ed for the Imprint late last year urging compromise and unity on child welfare policy by advocates who are seeking change on Capitol Hill. So we talked to Sims about how child welfare and juvenile justice also factor into education policy making in Washington, D.C., what she hopes and thinks will happen during the second Trump administration, in particular in regard to Trump's recent support during the campaign, at least, for bringing an end to the Department of Education. And we talked about much more than that with her. So without further ado, here is our conversation with Celia Sims. All right, we are joined today by Celia Sims, president and founder of the Abecedarian Group, which she started in March of 2023 after a career focused entirely or mostly on federal policy on education and child welfare. Celia, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Well, John, thank you for having me.
Before we get into the serious topics of education and child welfare and how they intersect and all that stuff, let's get these folks to know you a little bit. You got to give me at least one favorite. I'll give you the categories. You can give me more if you want, but you got to give me one. Movie, TV show, sports team, book, or musical group. Celia Sims, what do you got for the people?
Let's go with movie.
Okay.
Oh, favorite movie of all time? Yeah. Giant.
Giant?
Yeah.
Wait, I'm not sure I even know what that is. What is it?
That's an old movie. Elizabeth Taylor, Rock Hudson. It's based on an Edna Ferber novel about the oil world in Texas back in the, I guess 30s, 40s, 50s. He meets her in Virginia where it's all lush and green and then takes her back to West Texas, and it's a little different.
I'll put it on the list. Celia does not present as old enough to have chosen that movie, by the way. So I guess you're an old soul.
I am.
So, as I kind of described you've been at this for a while. How did federal education policy and child welfare kind of become a life's work for you?
Very not planned. I started my professional life as a high school Latin teacher and couldn't figure out what to do after teaching high school for like 4 years. So I went to graduate school, which a lot of people do, to try to figure out themselves. So I picked up a master's in Latin and still wasn't quite sure what to do, and ended up in the School of Education at the University of Michigan, and then was in a PhD program, did not finish because my mom got sick and was trying to get back to the East Coast to be closer to her, and ended up in the U.S. Department of Education for the first term of the George W. Bush administration. I had studied education policy, but I hadn't actually, quote, done policy until I did that. It was an incredible time to be there and learn because No Child Left Behind had been passed, which is a pretty big redo of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And I spent my time working with about 40 states in my portfolio. I didn't have California. That was part of the deal to take that many states on. And a couple other states that I didn't want to work with because they're very complicated. But I got to see how different and diverse education policy is. You can start with a federal law, but then how that has to trickle down to states and how it trickles down to districts. And then after the first term of the Bush administration, I got a call from Richard Burr's office. He'd just been elected in the Senate, and they were looking for a North Carolinian who might want to come work for him and cover the education portfolio. And so I made the move from there, and then primarily did education, but also did financial services and picked up childcare during the Great Recession of '08 as an issue. And then from childcare, got interested in child welfare, but my kind of really intensive work, I think, in child welfare has come since having left DC, moved to Houston about 8 years ago, and started volunteering a lot as a CASA in the greater Houston area. And that really has changed a lot of my views on policy in general to see it at the
Yeah.
most granular level at the local level.
I guess if you're looking at it from being an education expert and a policy expert in that realm, you know, child welfare, juvenile justice, those are peripheral issues. They come into play, but they're not the sun in the sky, right? How much did they ever factor in as you were working, for the Bush team, for Senator Burr, for the committee? I mean, did
I
that
would
stuff
say
register?
pretty small. And
Yeah.
I've said this to a lot of people. One of the difficulties in childcare used to be in the same issue bucket with child welfare, juvenile justice. Childcare has now kind of moved into, it's gotten a great deal more of attention, but it is typically an issue that gets thrown onto like the most junior staff member at the House and Senate. And it's just kind of an issue. You kind of hold it in your portfolio because usually not a lot happens. And then it gets, tossed around to the next younger staffer. I mean, we've had in child welfare and others, you've had some senior staffers who got interested in it and stuck with it, but there just aren't a lot. It was one like when I first did it, I didn't recognize the importance of it or that in the relationship into all the other issue areas. I will say that the older I got and explored, you hear from other constituents, you started to like pay more attention, but
Mm-hmm.
it's still a pretty small issue. I mean, at least even on the Republican side, and that's going to be the smaller group of advocates staff wise. But we used to joke that you could put all of the Republican child welfare staff, we could all fit in a telephone booth together
Oh
at
God,
one point.
that's not
That's
good.
kind of where it was. But I think it's kind of been the same way on the Dem side as well. There aren't, aside from a few kind of seasoned staffers, are just not a lot.
I think there's a little bit of concern. We've seen a lot of members of Congress who have a kind of keen interest in child welfare leaving, and some have passed away, some just retired or whatever. There's, I think, a rightful concern that institutional knowledge has lessened. But overstatement to say it's just as important, maybe even more, to have those people that are there on the committee working for 10, 20 years. You could have all the knowledge of the members you want, but if you don't have those people, you're going to have a tough time moving stuff.
Yeah, you need some seasoned staffers who have taken it under their wing, but we also need to really grow other staffers to care about it more deeply. And I find it pieces together until I got older. What I find fascinating about it from a policy perspective is it's not monolithic at all. I mean, you can't talk about child welfare or juvenile justice or really any of the social services without talking about this panoply of other issues. I mean, it's Medicaid policy plays in and the judiciary and behavioral and mental health. And I mean, to me, I thrive on learning new things. I find that fascinating to try to figure out, like, well, how do we make all these pieces work? And I think that's something we need to work with, like younger staffer as well as older staffer, to understand the complexity of it. And it drives maybe a further interest in it. And it's not like this is not an issue that you're going to be completely pigeonholed in, because if you could learn this and Medicaid, my God, that's a pretty powerful issue area to have of knowledge that makes you, whether you want to stay on the Hill or move elsewhere, gives you that ability
I think
to
Medicaid might
advance.
be the learn Chinese if you want to do international business. Learn Medicaid might be the best if you want to be on Capitol Hill for a while.
Yeah.
Staying on this topic, Celia wrote an op-ed for the Imprint that we published towards the end of last year, and I'll drop a link to that in show notes. I would urge people to read it. And in it, she's urging advocates with strongly held views in different directions to figure out where they can meet in the middle. And I just want to read a little bit, and then I want to ask Celia about it. But just a snippet from it. From years on Capitol Hill, I tell you that asking policymakers and their staff to pick between two divergent views is a losing strategy. Why would policymakers spend political capital wading into a fight among advocates when picking sides will only result in bad press and no thank yous? So I have a more specific question about that in a minute, but maybe for the less beltway oriented among us, can you expound a little on the legislation and policy process and how you describe it here? Because I think the perception of Congress is that it's more partisan than ever. And in that worldview, it's sort of counterintuitive, actually, to think that the idea of supporting a concept that would be disliked by some number of people would be bad for these guys. So in the education, child welfare, et cetera realm, how does this process play out such that that is your view, that this is a losing strategy to come with a divergent view?
It comes over just seeing this similar, strongly held opposing views stagnate issues for decades, which, I've seen I've seen it in financial services, I've seen it in education, I've seen it in childcare. To be sure, there is definitely more partisanship than, we've seen in a good while. At the same time, I step back even 20 years, there was partisanship. What we are losing, though, and have lost, I think, are more seasoned staff. Members are always important. They hold the election certificate. So I'm not saying that your members are blindly led by staff. They are not. But it is staff who are the gateway and the gatekeepers to a lot of issues getting onto committees' agendas. And it used to be a time on the Hill, regardless of partisanship and partisan battles, work together quietly, sometimes very openly, to work issues out. But I have just seen this so many times, even when people worked well together, if the advocates are at such diametrically opposed views of the world, it just becomes, it's like no one knows what to do at that point. It's like, okay, y'all can't agree. So how can we come to an agreement on where we're going to go to meet in the middle if you all tell us that like meeting in the middle is an impossibility? A lot of times what happens and why we've seen more and more reauthorizations not happen on time. That doesn't mean the programs go away, obviously, but we used to reauthorize things every 5 to 8 years. Some of those are now sitting out there, 15 years since we've touched them, some 20. Or you see what I think are just some very symbolic changes to statutes that, people can like raise a flag and say, woohoo, I did something.
Yeah.
But if everyone's going to really be honest about it, most of those changes are a couple words moved here or there that say you may do something that you are already eligible to do, but it's not really changing stuff on the ground. And I think that's more so, I think we're either stuck doing nothing or we've been doing a lot of kind of symbolic gestures, which haven't really moved the needle.
So it kind of occurred to me as I reread your piece to talk to you today. There's really 3 ways you can interpret kind of what you're urging people to do. There's compromise in the middle of mutual issues. So take a certain thing, a reauthorization, an idea, and what can everybody live with or agree upon? That's one. I would contend, I'll describe the other 2 that were kind of in my head, but I would contend that that's the most likely path to like milquetoast middling policy. There is agreeing to a set of changes or ideas that sort of includes things either side might not love, but as a whole can accept. And then there's the third, which is find a few things they happen to agree on and get 100% on board with that, save the rest to fight another day. We kind of saw that play out a little bit in Texas over the last couple of years. There was sort of this group of, pretty progressive and then very conservative legislators who were like, we do agree on these things. We can't stand each other's views on others. So let's move the stuff we agree on. Which did you mean? And where do you see like the most potential for any of them, as we move towards this administration?
I think it's all 3 of them, to be honest. It's going to vary by issue. And all of them can move you to better policy. And even that first one of like, can we meet in the middle, doesn't always get you milquetoast policy. It depends like, how far you go. I think the difficulty we have right now is there's so much screaming at each other going on. People won't even engage on 1, 2, or 3 that you just described. They're just going to they just sit it out. And so I think it could change, depending on the issue area you're on. I mean, like the Texas, if you're talking about like the legal pieces and the movement, Miranda rights and some of those, I mean, that is one option. It worked very well there and it didn't get you milquetoast policy. I think that is a pretty fundamental shift. Can be if it depending on the implementation of it.
I mean, I'm sure there's people that just feel differently about it, but there is really no mathematical question that the changes that happened in Texas have led to, significantly decreased entries into foster care.
And we're, and I think seeing that in maybe start to replicate some of it. But I mean, it does vary on the issue. As what I'm most concerned is, regardless of the way you go about it or getting to some type of compromise, whether it's these are the few things we can all agree on, so let's do that, or let's find something in the middle that probably neither party wholly loves, but we can get there, or this is what we can fully agree on the middle, and let's go forward. I don't really care. I'm agnostic on which one. What I don't like is the yelling, which is forcing people, which I see so much more so in education, childcare, child welfare, of just sit out on the side. I have, in my career up there, have told people, you all get your crap together, figure out what y'all can agree to, and come back to us.
So what did you think of child welfare and education policy in general during the first, we're moving very jarringly there. We were talking about Congress. Now I'm going to ask you about the previous Trump administration. What did you think of the child welfare and education policy in that first term? And what would you most like this incoming group to focus on? Where can changes to federal policy, in your opinion, be most impactful?
Now, are you talking about the intersection of the two or separately?
Let's go with the intersection, and feel free to kind of take it in both directions.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the intersection between education and child welfare, probably, I don't see a lot going on. I mean, I hate to say that. Because I don't think I've seen amount of innovative ideas to come forward. I mean, there's been, since we did the last reauthorization of ESEA, trying to ensure that like foster kids were treated more akin to homeless children in the terms of, if they change school districts. And I think there's a lot of implementation issues going on, a lot of people kind of just throwing up their hands, but I don't hear a lot of great solutions coming forward, possibly in terms of like the higher ed side of what you do with, foster youth going into school or try to, into college and how you do that. There's some stuff around the edges, but until someone comes up with some like great new innovative idea, I don't think they're going to do anything harmful, and I don't think they're going to do anything super innovative. Now, if somebody came forward with an idea, I think they might.
Okay, let me ask it this way. Okay, you were on the Hill forever. I don't mean to date you in that way. You're still a young gal, but
thank you.
you were there for a long time. Where do we most need somebody to come up with an innovative idea as it pertains to the intersection of child welfare and education? You know what I mean? Like, what part of that intersection do you say, man, do we need a good thinker to come up with something better than what we have now?
I think it is states and localities. And I mean, this is an area when I look back at what we did in the last reauthorization of ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is the primary K-12 thing.
Right.
There's a lot of nice words in that statute of how to make it better. But when you see what's going on in the field, this is a big problem and issue I will take issue with all of K-12 federal policy. You're at such a level removed from localities to understand the nuances of district lines, of school lines, of governance structures. What I would love to see is we could find a pot of money to drive some innovation at the local level to improve the issues that we might learn from, to pilot things, rather than just try to throw some words in a federal statute. Those magical words are going to change the face of this issue for thousands upon thousands of school districts. And maybe from there we can drive better policy, but I don't think there's one federal solution on that. But I do think there is a good role for the federal government to spend some money assisting locals in states, pilot something that might show us a better way to do things.
And just to make sure that people are following us here, in the ESEA, there was an effort to close a loophole that was sort of created by Fostering Connections, a child welfare bill that basically said, students who are in foster care have the right to stay in their school of origin unless a judge says that it's not in their best interest. And that was, in and of itself, an exception and an important one. Because obviously, if a judge feels like a kid going 100 miles a day to school is not in their best interest, they can say that, and that's sort of the end of that. But the problem with that just being a child welfare solve was that child welfare agencies don't tend to be the ones paying for and handling school transportation. So they sort of try to close the loophole by saying, okay, well, this is like everybody has to buy in. in my humble opinion, the problem was they didn't really do a tie goes to the runner type thing. So I think it's like sort of still out there, like whose job is it at the end of the day if, they don't agree, schools and child welfare, on like who's paying for and handling transportation. So yeah, that's still sort of out there. But I think you're right. I think it's good.
Yeah, I think that's the issue. Like with the I've seen down in the greater Houston area, that I stepped back. I was like, wow, we need to figure out at the local level how to make this all work, because it's not all just like when a child who's in child welfare, may move to another home. I mean, I'm in an area of Houston. I mean, I can spit and I'm in another school district.
Mhm.
I mean, there are so many school districts. So it's not just, trying to figure out the transportation between CPS, Child Protective Service, and one school district. It's like, well, now the child's in another school district and then another school district. And how do we make this work? And, again, like the other difficulty I think we have, which I've learned over time, when you put kind of a blanket requirement or a black and white requirement in a federal statute that doesn't understand like all the nuances at the state and local level.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, what you see is, states limits, well, the feds made me do it. And then the feds are like, well, only if the state would do their job. The locals are like, well, the state doesn't do its job. The feds don't do its job. And I mean, it's nice to have it, but I really think we need to be seeding some more innovation to figure out at the local and state level how to make all these levers of school transportation, the funding of it. How do you coordinate across these various school districts to make it as seamless as is possible and reasonable for kids to remain in their school of origin, if that school of origin is the best school for them? And sometimes it may not be the best school for them.
You may be onto something with, can we seed some people to think about, is transportation policy the only or best way? Because if we just get back down to kind of first principles, really the sort of principled view that's trying to be kind of codified is, if there's a ton of things not going great in a kid's life, but their friends at their school are their best support, and maybe those parents of those kids, by the way, and what they do after school, those kids, is really good. Like, we're jerks if we don't.
We are absolutely jerks. And like, sometimes we also need to figure out, like, could we find them a better placement closer to that school of origin versus just the first one that pops up, which is 50-mile ride down, the school.
Yeah. Sacramento did some interesting stuff on that in the 2010s era that I should make somebody on our team follow up on, see how that went. Because they're sort of going that way. Like, can we sort of tailor the search to zip codes and school districts to do this? And then we maybe avoid the food fight over transportation.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the Imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code podcast10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code podcast10 today.
Okay, so not much in the intersection of those two during the first Trump administration. Now, obviously, in this go-round of the campaign, there was some talk by the Trump people and himself about shuttering the Department of Education. And indeed, a bill by Senator Mike Rounds was already thrown into the hopper to that effect. Most people listening know that vast majority of child welfare policy comes out of the Department of Health and Human Services. But there are some foster and juvenile justice specific programs at the Department of Education. McKinney Vento is largely governed there. You get the neglected and delinquent youth account.
Right.
As a conservative policymaker, what do you think of the idea of ending the department? I guess let's start there. And what impact, if any, would that have, in your view, on students who are in foster care or students who are incarcerated? Like, what would you see that actually, on that local level you were just talking about, really mattering to them?
Yeah, like unlike the idea of shutting the department, it's not a new idea. It's been around since 1979 when the department was immediately
That's
created. I was a little shocked at how much attention like Project 2025 got because there is not one new idea in that 900-page book, which I did read through. I mean, it's
yeah.
all like old ideas that are just, had been repackaged. I agree with some of the ideas, but not all of them. I find it politically, not feasible to do away with the department anymore. And then, there's confusion on like Project 2025 was like, oh, like we're going to do away with the department, but we're really going to move a bunch of stuff to various agencies. So some of it would go to HHS and various groups in HHS, and some stuff, like if it was related to military kids, would go to Department of Defense, or Native American kids would go to Bureau, the Interior.
If you just look at rounds billed, that is a lot of what happens. It's like
Yeah.
this. So if you think of like the concept of federal funding going to schools, a lot of that goes through the Individuals Disabilities Education Act idea.
Right.
That's an enormous pot of money. That doesn't go away. It becomes an HHS program. So are there advantages to those things becoming part of, I guess, disability is a health thing, so HHS and whatever, do you see advantages or disadvantages or no?
The only area I see a potential advantage of moving out of the Department of Ed and putting in, whether you put it in Treasury or we create a standalone, is federal student assistance. If anyone following the FAFSA, which is the application your families have to apply, this last round of a redo, that was a perfect example of a Department of Ed and at the financial aid office, it is one of the largest banks in the US if you actually look at how much lending is going on, and it is not running up to professional standards. It does not have the type of controls it should have. I do think there's a very logical argument to say maybe student aid, that doesn't mean ending student aid, but mean the office it administers is maybe set up in a different way and maybe run from Treasury, since all of that stuff is backed by Treasury. Anyway, that might be a very reasonable proposal, and I think has more legs than probably any of the other ones I've seen. It's still a very hard lift to create even new agency, independent or sub-independent. I don't see a lot of advantages to any of the other kind of proposals that were put on the table of moving stuff to HHS. My personal opinion is HHS is too big as it is today. And many would say that like the Administration of Children and Families and all of that kind of gets lost within this mega agency that's covering, Medicaid, Medicare, FDA, like so much that I don't think we need. In some ways, like if you go back before the Department of Ed, there was the Health, Education, and Workforce, HUE. There was the agency.
Oh, yeah.
And then it got splintered and labor went one direction and Ed went off and that. So there's been some kind of like rhetoric about why don't we put HEW back together? Well, that just creates such a monstrosity of a size of an agency I can't even imagine. I think what's more likely to, be realistic is looking at a number of regulations that govern Title I, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. I haven't heard a lot of folks wanting to open up the IDA regulations, primarily because a lot of people don't complain about them like they used to. And I think everyone's a little afraid to tinker with it. But what I hear a lot more is trying to give more control back to states on some. And there have been oodles of regulations promulgated by both Republicans and Democrats in the last 25 years in education at the federal level that might be open for, again, trying to return some level of increased level of flexibility to states to try to work within their jurisdictions.
I want to wrap up. I mean, I think we got to this a little bit, but I'll challenge you to kind of think more outside the box than, say, school of origin, because I know that that's a big part of what education policy is. But, what I wanted to kind of hear from you with your experiences, what are you most certain needs to change about education policy as it relates to child welfare, and particularly for youth and foster care? And then sort of on the flip side, in your decades of experience with this stuff, what do you feel remains just unanswered or is a mystery? Like we don't even know enough to shape policy. So I guess another way to look at that is like, where do we need the most research or knowledge at a federal and national level?
if I take the population, whether it be, foster care youth or juvenile justice centers, I don't think we have enough information about what's going on educationally for those kids, good or bad. I mean, I think, the reason we've landed on in policy, really, school of origin, is that's the only thing people could put a quick finger on, of that that's what's going on. But there's so many, there's such a huge group of issues going on. They're going to be different from one child to the next. But I don't think we have a good pulse on if anything we're doing is working well or actually causing more harm than good.
Oof, that is dark to say that that's sort of the broader. I would agree with you, especially on juvenile justice. I don't think it's crazy to say that the presence of juvenile justice education policy in the federal level is borderline non-existent. I know there's some money, but I remember thinking that when they reauthorized the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act, and there's sort of just honestly like one of those throwaway lines that's like schools should prepare to accept credits from incarceration facilities and residential programs. And it's like, do you understand the issues that are behind that? Like, This is the ultimate, like, high five, we did it, guys. Like, now credits will transfer. Students enter those places behind, then we're not even going to pay attention to the quality of education when you're trying to educate kids that are on a range of like 10 years in these places, and then expect these schools to be completely okay with the black box that is that education. And that's not an indictment on any one of those places. That's just how naive and ridiculous that comes across.
Yeah, and I think another is you're bringing about like education that was done in a juvenile facility. I would say the same of, and I've just seen this, and I had never even thought about it until volunteering in the foster care system, of what's going on educationally for kids who are in residential treatment centers that have on-campus schools. And I've got a lot of questions. I think this is an area that is worth having a conversation about. Why are so many of those students kind of being forced to go to school at that center versus a regular public school? Because I have seen kids who were functioning just fine in a regular public school, but for other reasons, not being able to interact well in a home, they've ended up in a residential treatment center. But then that RTC, the schooling happens there. And I've got a lot of questions about the intersection even of the IDEA rights and possible violations of kids who are not being, I can't say for some of these kids, you can't say that's the least restrictive environment if they were functioning well in a regular public school before. And I think that's an area that's worth delving into. Same thing on, JJ, unfortunately they are, if they have been, quote, incarcerated for that period of time, going into a regular school can't happen. But we've got kids who are not incarcerated, who are kind of being treated as if they were incarcerated for a school setting.
Right. And I think of, we covered this, I want to say it was 2 years ago, there was a really insightful report done on graduation outcomes for youth who had experienced foster care in New York City. And it was an interesting moment because it was kind of the New York, like the city was part of it. They were kind of coming clean. We have thought we've been doing better on this than we have been. Mm-hmm. And the worst outcomes were for the youth who were in congregate care. Their graduation rate, I believe, I'm working off of memory here, but I'm pretty sure I'm right, was 5%. The second worst was youth who returned home. And I don't think that means, by the way, I did not read that at the time to think that's a point in favor of like, we shouldn't return kids home. It was, what are we doing to ensure school success as that happens? It seemed like a real opportunity point. Now, there was a move late in the Obama administration to kind of try and build some of this into AFCARs, into the data collection, which went away. I don't know that that's like a must add to AFCARs and have it every year, but it sure does seem like to your point, something we ought to look at, whether it's GAO or a one-off study or something to look at outcomes.
There's another, there's also been, there's some good research that's been done in the last couple of years. Nate Malkus, who's over at AEI, is actually concentrating a lot on chronic absenteeism.
Oh, yeah.
And they're taking that data down level by level. And chronic absenteeism is up, but we've always had chronic absenteeism. And one thing I've been asking is we never even really looked at who were the chronically absent prior. My gut says we have a lot of foster youth, kids who've been in and out of JJ, and others probably in there. And I worry about sometimes is some people just kind of believe, well, that's just, that's the hard knocks of that population. And just that's who it is. And we don't think about it. And I don't think it has to be that way. It will be that way if we all just like, oh, sorry, that was another really bad opportunity, that came your way. Because we've obviously seen, they're anecdotal, but we have seen, kids who've been in the foster youth for longer periods of time with multiple moves who do make it through the system. Like, what is it? That's where we need to be probably, what is it that helped them get through? And it's probably, again, there's not going to be one answer to that, but we do need to know what, the elements are to help kids, succeed, whether it's through catching up, it's relationships, which is probably going to have a great deal with any of this of like, can I feel connected to a school? Because I don't think that, particularly middle and high schoolers, if they don't feel they're getting anything out of it and it's not a, pleasant or a positive experience, it's really easy for me to understand why they just kind of like out the door I go.
Celia Sims, president and founder of the Abecedarian Group. Thank you for joining us.
Well, John, thank you for having me.
Thanks to Celia Sims of the Abecedarian Group for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Onjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. But we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always reach us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.